In the quiet hush of pre-dawn, when the world below still slumbers in shadows and the first pale light begins to brush the eastern horizon, there exists a place where earth and heaven converge in a sacred embrace. This is no ordinary mountain, no mere accumulation of stone and soil thrust upward by the violent convulsions of a restless planet. This is Olympus, the mountain that touched the sky, the axis upon which the cosmos itself seemed to turn. For the ancient Greeks, Olympus stood as both a physical reality and a divine metaphor, a limestone colossus reaching nearly 3,000 meters into the heavens of northern Greece, yet simultaneously existing as a realm beyond mortal reach, shrouded in clouds that were said to be impenetrable, concealing from human eyes the gleaming palaces of gods who shaped the destiny of worlds. The mountain rises from the Thessalian plains with a majesty that commands reverence, its highest peaks piercing the atmosphere where oxygen grows thin and eagles dare not venture. Modern geology tells us that Olympus formed during the Hellenic orogeny, when the African and Eurasian tectonic plates collided with a force that folded the Earth's crust like parchment, creating this limestone behemoth over 200 million years ago. But for the ancient mind, such scientific explanations would have seemed pale and insufficient compared to the living, breathing reality of a mountain that was simultaneously a place and a concept, a geographical feature, and the very seat of divine authority. The ancient Greeks did not need satellites or seismographs to understand Olympus. They knew it in their bones, in the stories whispered from grandparent to child beside olive wood fires, in the rituals that structured their days, in the very language they used to describe the workings of fate and fortune. To stand at the foot of Olympus in antiquity was to stand at the threshold between the human and the superhuman, the mortal and the immortal. The mountain was visible from vast distances across the Greek world, its snow-capped peaks catching the golden light of sunset in a display that seemed deliberately theatrical, as if the gods themselves arranged this daily spectacle to remind mortals of their presence. Yet the summit remained perpetually hidden, wrapped in clouds that the ancients believed were placed there by divine will, a cosmic curtain that no mortal eye could penetrate. These were not mere meteorological phenomena, but a deliberate barrier, a veil between the realm of suffering humanity and the paradise of the deathless ones. The clouds themselves were said to be controlled by the Horae, the goddesses of the seasons, who served as celestial gatekeepers, opening and closing the gates of heaven with the rhythm of nature's cycles. The very name Olympus resonated with power and significance, appearing in the earliest Greek literature, in Hesiod's Theogony and Homer's Iliad, not as a distant abstraction, but as a concrete location where the gods walked, feasted, argued, and decided the fates of both men and nations. When Homer described the gods gathering in the halls of Zeus, his audience did not imagine a purely spiritual realm, but a magnificent palace complex built of stone with bronze foundations, surrounded by courtyards paved with gold, where the air itself was filled with music that mortal ears could never hope to hear. The poet's descriptions were so vivid, so specific in their architectural details, that listeners could almost smell the ambrosia steaming on golden tables and hear the lyre of Apollo floating through marble corridors. This was not fantasy in the modern sense, but a reality so certain that it shaped the way Greeks understood their place in the cosmos. The psychological impact of Olympus on the ancient Greek imagination cannot be overstated. In a world where life was precarious, where disease could strike without warning, where crops failed and wars erupted with devastating regularity. The existence of Olympus provided a framework for understanding suffering and hope. The gods were not distant, perfect beings in some abstract heaven. They were powerful, capricious personalities who lived just beyond the clouds, whose conflicts and affections directly influenced the daily lives of mortals below. When thunder rolled across the sky, it was not a simple atmospheric discharge, but Zeus wielding his thunderbolt, expressing his pleasure or displeasure. When the sea grew angry and ships were swallowed by waves, it was Poseidon striking the earth with his trident from his underwater palace near Euboea. The mountain made the divine accessible, comprehensible, almost neighborly, while maintaining the necessary awe and distance that divinity required. The ancient Greeks built their entire cosmological understanding around this sacred mountain. It was not merely the home of the gods, but the center of a complex spiritual ecology that connected all levels of existence. From the depths of Tartarus, where the defeated Titans were imprisoned in eternal darkness, to the middle realm of Earth, where mortals struggled and loved and died, to the heights of Olympus, where the deathless ones feasted and governed, the mountain stood as the axis mundi, the world axis that held the entire structure of reality together. This three-tiered universe was not a philosophical abstraction, but a lived reality that influenced where temples were built, how festivals were celebrated, and what stories were told to explain the mysteries of existence. The mountain's physical presence made the cosmic structure tangible, visible, a constant reminder that the universe was ordered, purposeful, and governed by powerful beings who could be approached through prayer, sacrifice, and proper living. Before Olympus rose from the Thessalian plains, before Zeus claimed its summit as his throne, before the first stone of the divine palaces was laid, there existed only chaos, the yawning void, the primordial abyss from which all things would eventually emerge. This was not chaos in the modern sense of disorder and confusion, but something more profound and terrible. A formless, boundless expanse without light or darkness, without up or down, without time or space as we understand these concepts. It was the ultimate nothingness, yet it contained within itself the potential for everything. From this ineffable void, the first beings emerged not through birth or creation in any conventional sense, but through a process that the ancient Greeks could only describe through metaphor and myth, through poetry that strained at the edges of language's ability to capture the birth of reality itself. The first to emerge from chaos was Gaia, the earth, broad-bosomed and all-nurturing, the foundation upon which all subsequent existence would be built. She was not merely the physical planet, but the principle of solidity, permanence, and fertility, the mother who would give birth to the mountains, the seas, the sky, and eventually to the gods themselves. Gaia emerged as a conscious entity, aware of her own solitude in the vastness of chaos, and from her fertile depths she brought forth Uranus, the star-studded sky, to cover her like a protective dome. This union of earth and sky was the first marriage, the primordial coupling that established the pattern for all relationships that would follow. Together, Gaia and Uranus became the parents of the first generation of divine beings, the 12 Titans, the 3 Cyclopes, and the 3 Hecaton chairs, each more powerful and terrible than the last. The Titans were beings of immense power and majesty, embodiments of fundamental forces and principles. There was Oceanus, the world-encircling river that marked the boundary of the known cosmos. There was Hyperion, the god of heavenly light, and his sister Theia, who shone with a brilliance that would later be inherited by their children. There was Coeus and Creus and Iapetus, each holding dominion over aspects of the primal world that would eventually be divided among their successors. But the most significant of the Titans for our story were Cronus, the youngest but most ambitious, and Rhea, his sister and eventual consort. These two would become the direct ancestors of the Olympian gods, the bridge between the old order and the new, their lives a tragedy that would set the stage for the Titanomachy and the rise of Olympus. Uranus, however, proved to be a tyrannical father, so threatened by the power of his children that he pushed them back into the womb of Gaia, imprisoning them in the hidden depths of the earth. This caused Gaia immense pain, and she fashioned a sickle of adamantine, the hardest substance in existence, and urged her children to rise up against their father. Only Cronus had the courage to take the sickle, and, in a moment of shocking violence that would echo through generations, he castrated Uranus, separating the sky from the earth and casting the severed parts into the sea. From the blood that fell upon the earth sprang the Furies, the giants, and other beings of vengeance and power. From the foam that gathered around Uranus's discarded flesh in the ocean emerged Aphrodite, the goddess of love and beauty, born fully formed from the violent dissolution of the primordial union. Cronus thus became the ruler of the cosmos, but he inherited his father's paranoia. Learning of a prophecy that he would be overthrown by his own child, he took the terrible precaution of swallowing each of his offspring as they were born to Rhea. Hestia, Demeter, Hera, Hades, and Poseidon were each consumed whole, imprisoned in the darkness of Cronus's stomach, alive but powerless. The Titan king sat upon his black iron throne, the crescent flint sickle he had used to overthrow his father planted upright beside him like a grim sundial. Each birth of his children with Rhea was met by thunderous echoes as temple pillars seemed to shudder in anticipation of his consuming hunger. Each act was sealed in silence by the devouring Titan, his mind consumed by fear of the prophecy that cursed him as it had cursed his father. Only the youngest, Zeus, escaped this fate through Rhea's cunning and desperation. The goddess, her heart breaking with each loss, her spirit breaking beneath the weight of maternal grief that could never fully express itself, made a fateful decision. When her time came to give birth to Zeus, she retreated to a cave on the island of Crete, a sanctuary hidden from the eyes of her tyrannical husband. There, in a place where no Titan's gaze could penetrate, she gave birth to her sixth child. The infant's cries were music to her ears, each sound a rebellion against Cronus's dominion, each breath a declaration of life that would not be silenced. Yet she knew she could not keep the child there. Cronus would never stop searching, never cease his paranoid vigil. She needed to deceive him, needed to outwit a god whose entire existence was defined by the fear that drove him to infanticide. Working quickly, with hands that trembled not from weakness but from the intensity of her purpose, Rhea found a stone wrapped in swaddling clothes as if it were an infant. She presented this false child to Cronus, and the Titan king, his mind so consumed by terror and his perception so clouded by paranoia, failed to see through the deception. He took the swaddled stone from Rhea without suspicion and swallowed it in one gulp, believing he had once again destroyed a potential threat. The tyrant had no idea that a cold stone now lay in his belly in place of his son. Meanwhile, the infant Zeus was entrusted by his mother Rhea to a safe haven, a cave on Mount Dicte or Mount Ida that became his sanctuary. There, the nymphs Adrasteia and Ide, along with their attendants, the armed spirits known as the Curites, were tasked with raising him. They nourished the young Zeus with a mixture of milk from the goat Amalthea and honey, raising him with great care in this hidden place where the Titan's shadow could never reach. The Curites, fierce protectors with their bronze armor and curved shields, stood guard around the cave, their movements deliberate and loud, their footsteps thundering across the mountainside. When the infant Zeus cried, they would bang their shields and weapons together with tremendous noise, creating a cacophony that would drown out the sound of his wails, ensuring that no enemy could locate the hidden child through the simple act of hearing his cries. This was how the King of Gods grew to maturity in secret, nourished by divine milk and honey, his divine essence strengthening with each passing day until he was ready to challenge his father's tyranny. Upon reaching adulthood, Zeus began his campaign of vengeance against his father. With the help of Metis, the goddess of wisdom and cunning thought, he obtained a potion to trick Cronus. The substance was crafted with ancient knowledge, a mixture of mustard and wine that would induce violent nausea in the Titan king. When Zeus served as Cronus's cupbearer, offering the king his drinks with the formal respect due to the ruler of the cosmos, he administered this emetic. Cronus, unsuspecting and trusting in his position of absolute power, drank the concoction without hesitation. The effects were immediate and overwhelming. The Titan king was racked with violent convulsions, his body expelling what it had held for so long in desperate protection against prophecy. First came the stone, Cronus regurgitating the rock that had been his false victory. Then, one by one, his 5 divine children were disgorged, fully grown and armed, grateful to their brother for their liberation and immediately pledging their allegiance to his cause. Hestia, Demeter, Hera, Hades, and Poseidon emerged from their father's body ready to fight, ready to reshape the cosmos according to a vision that was not based on terror and tyranny, but on order, structure, and shared governance. The division between the old gods and the new was now absolute, the family schism irreparable. The Titans, led by Cronus, would fight to maintain their primordial authority, while the younger gods, led by Zeus, would fight for a new order, one based not on absolute tyranny, but on a more complex system of governance and distributed power among the deities. The war that followed, known as the Titanomachy, would rage for 10 full years, a decade of such cosmic violence that the very foundations of reality shook with each clash. The Titans, established in their fortress on Mount Olympus in Thessaly, wielded powers that were raw and ancient, forces that had shaped the world since its inception. The Olympians, based on Mount Olympus, fought with the vigor of youth and the innovation of necessity, discovering new strategies and forging alliances that would prove decisive. Zeus, displaying the strategic genius that would define his reign, understood that victory required more than raw power. It required alliances, technology, and the willingness to challenge the fundamental assumptions of cosmic order. His first masterstroke was the liberation of the Cyclopes from their imprisonment in Tartarus, the deepest pit of the underworld. The Cyclopes, those one-eyed giants of prodigious craftsmanship, had been imprisoned by Uranus and later Cronus, feared for their ability to create weapons of unparalleled power. When Zeus descended into the darkness of Tartarus and offered them freedom in exchange for their skills, they accepted with a gratitude that bordered on worship. In their volcanic forges beneath the earth, where rivers of molten stone flowed like water and the air itself shimmered with heat that could anneal divine metal, the Cyclopes set to work. They crafted for Zeus the thunderbolt, a weapon that captured the very essence of storm and sky, a three-pronged spear of celestial fire that could shatter any defense and reduce any opponent to smoldering ash. For Poseidon, they forged the trident, a three-pointed spear that gave its wielder dominion over all waters, capable of summoning tsunamis with a thrust and causing earthquakes with a stamp of its butt upon stone. For Hades, they created the helmet of darkness, a piece of armor that rendered its wearer invisible to gods and mortals alike, allowing its wearer to move unseen through any battlefield, to strike from shadows, to observe without being observed. These weapons proved decisive, but they were not the only innovations that turned the tide. The Hecaton chairs, the hundred-handed ones, also freed from Tartarus by Zeus, brought a different kind of power to the Olympian cause. Each of these giants had 50 heads and 100 arms, and their strength was such that they could hurl boulders the size of houses with the ease of a child throwing pebbles. In the final assault on the Titan stronghold, they rained down such a barrage of stone that the defenders of Othrys were buried beneath mountains of their own making, their fortress crushed into rubble, their will broken by the sheer overwhelming force of this unconventional artillery. The decisive battle came on a day when the fabric of reality itself seemed to thin, when the boundaries between earth and sky, sea and underworld became fluid and permeable. Zeus led the charge from Olympus, his thunderbolts arcing across the heavens in patterns of devastating beauty, each strike a work of art that wrote itself in fire across the sky. The thunderbolt, that divine weapon forged by the Cyclopes, was not a crude instrument, but a tool of such precision that Zeus could strike a single tower without damaging the building surrounding it, could incinerate a specific enemy while leaving his allies standing safely nearby. Poseidon rose from the depths, his trident stirring the seas into a frenzy that sent waves crashing against the Titan defenses, undermining their foundations and drowning their lower fortifications. The very earth trembled at his command, mountains split asunder beneath his feet, and the Thessalian plain became a landscape of lakes and chasms as he weaponized the geological nature of his being. Hades, invisible in his helmet of darkness, moved through the enemy ranks like a shadow, sowing confusion and fear, his bident striking from unseen angles, his presence known only by the bodies that fell mysteriously without visible cause. Hera, queen of the gods, proved herself a master strategist, coordinating the movements of the Olympian forces with a precision that spoke of divine intelligence applied to the art of war. Demeter caused the very earth to erupt with thorns and briars, entangling the Titan foot soldiers in vegetation that grew faster than they could cut, making their movement toward the Olympian positions impossible. Hestia maintained the sacred hearth fires that kept the Olympian camp inviolate, ensuring that the strength of her siblings did not wane, that their unity remained unbroken. The Titans fought with the desperation of those who know they are defending not just territory, but an entire way of existence. Atlas, the Titan who held up the sky, used his immense strength to tear up entire mountains and hurl them at the Olympian forces. His throws were so powerful that entire ranges were moved, creating geological features that would define the Thessalian landscape for millennia to come. Prometheus, whose name means forethought, employed his cunning to set traps and ambushes that would have decimated lesser armies, using his knowledge of future events to position Titan forces where Olympian attacks would be least effective. Yet the Olympians had something the Titans lacked: a vision of the future, a belief that the cosmos could be organized differently, that power could be shared and delegated, that the world could be governed by council and consensus rather than by absolute decree. This ideological advantage, combined with their superior weaponry and the sheer overwhelming force of the Hecaton cheers, gradually wore down the Titan resistance. After 10 years of unrelenting conflict, the Titans were finally defeated, their forces scattered, their stronghold reduced to ruins. Zeus, showing the prudence that would characterize his rule, did not simply destroy his defeated relatives. Instead, he imprisoned them in Tartarus, the same pit from which he had liberated his allies, setting the 100-handed ones as their eternal guards. This decision reflected a deeper understanding of cosmic balance. The Titans represented forces that, while dangerous in their raw form, were necessary for the stability of reality. They could not be destroyed, but they could be contained, their power channeled and controlled rather than extinguished. Cronus himself was cut into pieces, his essence distributed and bound, ensuring that he could never again pose a threat to the new order. The victory in the Titanomachy established Mount Olympus not just as a mountain, but as the center of the cosmic order. The Olympian gods, having earned their supremacy through 10 years of war, now set about the task of governance, of dividing the universe among themselves and establishing the protocols by which they would rule. This division was not arbitrary, but reflected a sophisticated understanding of the different domains of existence. Zeus claimed the sky and the heavens, becoming the god of weather, law, and cosmic order. Poseidon took the seas and all waters, becoming lord of the deep and the shaker of earth. Hades received the underworld, ruling over the dead and the hidden treasures of the earth. This tripartite division created a balance of power that would prevent any single deity from becoming a tyrant like Cronus, a system of checks and balances that mirrored the emerging political philosophies of the Greek city-states and ensured that the younger gods would never again find themselves living under the thumb of tyrannical authority. With the Titanomachy concluded and the cosmos divided, the Olympian gods turned their attention to the construction of their eternal home, transforming Mount Olympus from a mere mountain into the most magnificent architectural complex ever conceived, a palace city that would serve as the seat of divine government for millennia. The approach to Olympus was itself a masterpiece of celestial engineering, a journey that began at the base of the mountain where mortal worshippers would leave their offerings and ascended through layers of increasingly divine atmosphere. The entrance was guarded by the Horae, the goddesses of the seasons, who controlled the great cloud gates that served as the threshold between the earthly and the heavenly realms. These gates were not of wood or metal, but of condensed vapor, solidified moonlight, barriers that could be rendered impassable by divine will, ensuring that no mortal could accidentally stumble into the realm of the gods. Beyond these gates lay the divine Acropolis, a fortified complex that Homer described with the precision of an architect drafting plans. The buildings were constructed of stone with foundations of bronze, a combination that spoke of both natural beauty and supernatural strength. The stone was not ordinary limestone, but a material that gleamed with an inner light, polished to such perfection that it reflected the divine radiance of its inhabitants, creating an atmosphere of perpetual golden twilight. The bronze foundations were said to be unbreakable, forged by Hephaestus in his subterranean forges and laid with such skill that they would withstand not just the ravages of time, but the very ending of the cosmos itself. Surrounding the central palaces were courtyards paved with gold, the metal formed into tiles so perfectly fitted that not even a blade of grass could find purchase between them, the surface warm to the touch despite the mountain's icy heights. At the center of this divine city stood the palace of Zeus, the largest and most magnificent structure on Olympus, a building that served simultaneously as royal residence, council hall, and cosmic command center. The main hall was vast beyond mortal comprehension, its ceiling so high that clouds formed beneath it, its columns so thick that a dozen men could not encircle them with outstretched arms. The throne room featured Zeus's own seat, a throne carved from a single massive diamond, its facets catching and amplifying light so that it served as the sun for the divine realm, casting rainbows that danced across the marble walls. Behind the throne room were private chambers, including Zeus's personal bedroom and storage rooms that held treasures beyond counting, gifts from grateful mortals and spoils from divine conflicts. The main hall served both as a place for feasting and as the council chamber where the gods would gather to deliberate on matters affecting the cosmos, from the fate of individual mortals to the balance of natural forces that govern the world below. The palace complex included individual residences for each of the major Olympian deities, each reflecting the personality and domain of its occupant. Hera's quarters were elegant and orderly, with rooms decorated in peacock motifs, the walls inlaid with lapis lazuli and mother of pearl that shimmered with an opalescent light. Her chambers overlooked gardens that bloomed with flowers that never faded, roses that maintained their perfect bloom for eternity, lilies that never lost their fragrance. Poseidon's palace, while technically on Olympus, had a unique architectural feature. Its lower levels extended into the sea itself, allowing the god of waters to move seamlessly between his two domains. The walls were decorated with coral and pearl. The floors were of polished abalone shell that rippled with an inner luminescence, and entire walls were windows looking out into the ocean depths, where schools of fish moved like living jewels and sea nymphs danced in currents of azure light. Athena's residence reflected her nature as goddess of wisdom and warfare, a library fortress where scrolls containing all knowledge ever discovered or imagined were stored in shelves that reached to ceilings lost in shadow. Her chambers were spare and functional, decorated with maps of the cosmos and diagrams of philosophical principles, yet they possessed a stark beauty that spoke of the elegance of pure thought. Apollo's palace was designed around music and light, with a central courtyard where his golden lyre hung suspended in mid-air, playing chords of such perfect harmony that they structured the very mathematics of reality. The walls were painted with scenes of the sun's journey across the sky, each moment captured in pigments that actually glowed with captured sunlight. Artemis maintained a separate wing that connected to the wild places of the world, a forested sanctuary where deer roamed through halls open to a moonlit sky that existed only within her chambers. Hephaestus, the divine smith, had his workshops beneath the main palace complex, forges that burned with fires hotter than the heart of stars, where metals flowed like water and were shaped into objects of impossible beauty and function. The workshops were a cacophony of sound and industry, the ringing of hammers on anvils creating rhythms that underlay the music of the spheres, the glow of molten metal providing illumination that was both practical and artistic. His personal quarters, by contrast, were humble and functional, reflecting his lameness and his preference for honest labor over ostentatious display. Aphrodite's chambers were the most luxurious on Olympus. Walls covered in silk that rippled with captured starlight, floors of rose quartz that emitted a perpetual soft fragrance, mirrors that showed not just reflection, but the deepest desires of those who gazed into them. Her bed was said to be carved from a single piece of cedar wood, cushioned with feathers from the wings of Eros himself. The divine architecture extended beyond individual palaces to include communal spaces where the gods gathered for various purposes. There was the great feast hall, where golden tables were arranged in a perfect circle, symbolizing the equality of the Olympian council despite Zeus's authority as king. The tables were set with plates of polished silver that never tarnished, goblets of crystal that sang when nectar was poured into them, and utensils forged from a metal that combined gold's beauty with diamond's hardness. The courtyard before Zeus's palace served as an assembly area where the gods could gather when he summoned a full council, a space surrounded by covered passages supported by columns entwined with living vines that bore grapes that fermented themselves into wine. The floor was a mosaic of precious stones depicting the history of the cosmos, from the emergence of chaos to the latest divine council, the scenes shifting and changing as new events unfolded, ensuring that the floor itself was a living history. The mountain's summit, Mythicus, served as Zeus's personal throne when he wished to survey the world below. From this highest point, where the air was so thin that only gods could breathe comfortably, he could see across the entire Greek world, from the mountains of Macedon to the islands of the Aegean, from the plains of Troy to the coasts of Crete. The throne at the summit was not a constructed seat, but a natural formation of rock that had been shaped and polished by divine will. Its back, a natural outcropping that had been carved with scenes of his victories. Its seat worn smooth by countless years of divine presence. When Zeus sat upon this throne, lightning would crackle around his head, forming a crown of living electricity, and his gaze could penetrate stone, water, and flesh to see the truth of all things. From this vantage, he observed the doings of mortals, the movements of armies, the prayers of the faithful, and the schemes of those who would challenge his authority. The divine government of Olympus operated through a council of 12 principal deities, each possessing a throne in the Great Hall and a vote in matters of cosmic significance. Though Zeus's will usually prevailed through a combination of persuasion, authority, and the implicit threat of his thunderbolt. This council was not a static institution, but a living, breathing assembly of powerful personalities whose interactions shaped the mythology of the ancient world. Their daily lives on Olympus followed rhythms both familiar and alien to mortal experience, combining bureaucratic routine with cosmic drama, domestic tranquility with world-shaking conflict, eternal wisdom with petty jealousy. Understanding the individual natures of these 12 gods is essential to comprehending how Olympus functioned as both a home and a government, a family and a ruling elite. Zeus, as king of the gods and ruler of Mount Olympus, sat at the head of the council, his throne elevated slightly above the others, not by physical height, but by a subtle arrangement of the floor that created the impression of greater stature. He was the god of the sky, lightning, thunder, law, order, and justice, his domains covering the most fundamental aspects of both nature and society. His symbols, the thunderbolt, eagle, oak tree, bull, and scepter, were not mere decorations, but manifestations of his power. each representing a different aspect of his authority. The thunderbolt, forged by the Cyclopes, was his primary weapon and symbol, a three-pronged spear of living lightning that returned to his hand after being thrown, its passage through the sky creating the sound of thunder that mortals heard below. The eagle was his sacred messenger, a bird of such keen sight that it could see the truth of any matter and report it directly to the king of gods. Zeus's personality was as complex as his domain was vast. He possessed a regal bearing that commanded respect even from those who chafed under his rule. Yet he was also capable of terrible rages that could level cities and sink fleets. His wisdom was profound, earned through the crucible of the Titanomachy and tempered by millennia of governance, but it was often applied selectively, compromised by his numerous affairs and the children they produced. His marriage to Hera was both a political alliance and a personal tragedy, a union that stabilized the divine government while generating endless conflict through his infidelity. Despite his flaws, Zeus maintained his position through a combination of genuine leadership, strategic brilliance, and the raw power represented by his thunderbolt. He presided over the divine councils with a charisma that could sway even the most stubborn opponents, his voice carrying the weight of thunder, his words shaping reality itself. Hera, queen of the gods and goddess of marriage, women, childbirth, and family, occupied the throne to Zeus's right, her position reflecting both her status as his wife and her authority as a powerful deity in her own right. She was the youngest daughter of Cronus and Rhea, sister and wife of Zeus, a relationship that embodied the complex family dynamics of the divine world. Her symbols, the peacock, cuckoo, and cow, each represented different facets of her domain. The peacock, with its iridescent tail feathers that seemed to contain the eyes of Argus, symbolized her all-seeing vigilance over the sanctity of marriage and the proper order of the household. The cuckoo recalled the form Zeus took to seduce her, a memory that was both a foundation of their union and a source of perpetual resentment. The cow represented her nurturing aspect, the protective mother who would defend her children and her principles with a fury that matched any warrior's rage. Hera's daily life on Olympus was dominated by the twin responsibilities of managing the divine household and seeking vengeance against Zeus's countless lovers and their offspring. She maintained the order of the palace, ensuring that the feasts were properly prepared, the divine servants performed their duties, and the protocols of Olympus were observed with appropriate reverence. Yet her true passion was directed outward, toward the mortals and lesser deities who had the misfortune to attract Zeus's wandering eye. Io was transformed into a cow and driven mad by a gadfly sent by Hera. Semele was tricked into demanding that Zeus reveal his true form, the sight of which incinerated her mortal body. Heracles was tormented throughout his life by Hera's machinations, his legendary labors a direct result of her attempts to destroy him. These actions, while often cruel, were not born of simple jealousy, but of a deep commitment to the principle of marital fidelity and the proper order of the cosmos, which Zeus's behavior constantly threatened to disrupt. Poseidon, god of the seas, earthquakes, storms, and horses, held sway over a domain that covered 70% of the Earth's surface, making him, in some ways, more powerful than Zeus in terms of sheer territorial control. His palace beneath the waves near Euboea was a wonder of marine architecture, its walls of coral and pearl, its floors of polished shell that glowed with an inner luminescence. When he ascended to Olympus for council meetings, he carried with him the scent of salt and the sound of waves, his trident leaving wet marks on the marble floors that evaporated into steam in the divine atmosphere. His symbols, the trident, horse, bull, and dolphin, represented his dominion over both the destructive and nurturing aspects of water. The trident was his weapon of choice, capable of splitting islands in half and summoning tsunamis with a casual gesture. Horses were his sacred animals, creatures whose wild spirit and strength mirrored the untamable nature of the sea itself. Poseidon's relationship with the other gods was characterized by a grudging respect that often bordered on resentment. He had desired the throne of Olympus for himself, and during the Titanomachy had demonstrated such power that Zeus had been forced to acknowledge him as an equal in strength, if not in authority. The two brothers shared a complex dynamic, allies in war but rivals in peace, each wary of the other's ambitions. Demeter, goddess of the harvest, agriculture, fertility, and the seasons, represented the earth's bounty and the cycles of growth and decay that structured mortal life. Her throne in the council hall was carved from a single piece of petrified wood, its grain containing the history of every tree that had ever grown, and she sat upon it with the stateliness of a queen whose kingdom was the very soil beneath mortal feet. Her symbols, the poppy, wheat, torch, cornucopia, and pig, spoke of both the gentleness of cultivation and the ferocity of a mother's protective instinct. The poppy represented the sleep of winter and the eternal rest that awaited all living things. Wheat was the staff of life, the golden grain that sustained civilization. The torch symbolized the search for her lost daughter, Persephone, a quest that would define much of her mythology and explain the changing of the seasons. Demeter's daily existence on Olympus was centered on the management of agricultural cycles, a responsibility that required constant attention to the complex interplay of weather, soil, and seed. She worked in concert with Zeus, who provided the rain, with Helios, who supplied the sunlight, and with the nymphs who tended the wild places of the world. Her most profound myth, the abduction of Persephone by Hades, transformed her from a benevolent provider into a figure of terrible grief and wrath. When her daughter was taken to the underworld, Demeter withdrew her gifts from the earth, causing a famine so severe that mortals starved and the gods themselves felt the absence of sacrifices. Only when a compromise was reached, with Persephone spending half the year above ground and half below, did Demeter restore her blessings, creating the cycle of seasons that endures to this day. This myth established her as a deity whose love was as powerful as her anger, whose grief could reshape the entire world. Hestia, goddess of the hearth, fire, and domesticity, occupied a unique position among the Olympians, both literally and figuratively. Her throne was positioned at the center of the council chamber, a symbol that the hearth fire was the heart of both divine and mortal society. She was the firstborn of Cronus and Rhea, the eldest of the Olympian generation, yet she voluntarily relinquished her seat among the 12 to Dionysus, choosing instead to maintain the eternal flame that burned at the center of Olympus and in every home that honored the gods. Her symbols were the hearth and its flame, simple elements that represented the most profound aspects of civilization: community, warmth, sustenance, and the continuity of family and tradition. She was goddess of the right ordering of domesticity, the one who ensured that the fundamental structures of society remained stable and pure. Hestia's daily life was quiet compared to the dramatic exploits of her siblings, yet it was essential to the functioning of Olympus. She tended the central fire, ensuring that it never dimmed, that its flames always burned with a steady, reassuring light. She presided over the preparation of ambrosia and nectar, her presence sanctifying the divine food that sustained the immortality of the gods. Her vow of virginity, sworn to both Zeus and herself, set her apart from the romantic entanglements that complicated the lives of the other deities, giving her a position of neutral authority that all respected. When disputes arose among the gods, it was often Hestia who proposed the compromises that allowed counsel to continue, her wisdom drawn from the quiet contemplation of flame and the steady observation of both divine and mortal affairs. Her decision to step down from the 12 in favor of Dionysus was not an act of weakness, but of strength, a recognition that the newer god of wine and ecstasy represented forces that were increasingly important in Greek culture, while her own domain, though eternal, needed her full attention rather than divided council obligations. The daily life of the gods on Mount Olympus was sustained by substances that existed nowhere else in the cosmos, foods that defined the very nature of divinity and separated the immortals from the mortals who worshipped them from the world below. These were ambrosia and nectar, the food and drink of the gods, substances so potent that their consumption transformed the very essence of those who partook, turning mortal blood into ichor, the divine life force that made the Olympians deathless. The procurement, preparation, and consumption of these divine provisions were rituals that structured the eternal days on Olympus, providing not just sustenance, but a constant reaffirmation of the gods' status as beings beyond the reach of time, decay, and death. Ambrosia, the food of the gods, was not a simple dish, but a substance that defied mortal description. It was delivered to Olympus each morning by white doves that flew from the edge of the world, birds whose feathers glowed with an inner light and whose flight was silent as moonlight. These doves carried the ambrosia in vessels of carved crystal, containers that preserved its potency and prevented its power from dissipating into the atmosphere of the mortal world. The substance itself was described as being both solid and fluid, its consistency changing based on the needs and desires of those who consumed it. To some, it appeared as a golden bread, light as air, yet filling beyond measure. To others, it was a paste of honey and sunlight, sweet beyond any mortal confection, but possessing savory notes that spoke of power and eternity. The taste was said to be unique to each deity, reflecting their individual natures. To Zeus, it tasted of thunder and authority. To Hera, of order and duty. To Apollo, of harmonious light. To Artemis, of wild freedom. Nectar, the divine drink, was ambrosia's liquid counterpart, a beverage that flowed like honeyed wine, but possessed qualities far beyond any mortal vintage. It was served in cups of gold that never emptied, poured by Hebe, the goddess of youth, or by Ganymede, the beautiful mortal boy Zeus had taken as his cupbearer. The act of pouring was itself a ritual, the liquid falling in a stream that caught and refracted light, creating rainbows that danced across the feast hall, each color representing a different aspect of divine power. Nectar was described as being both cool and warm, its temperature adjusting to the drinker's preference, its flavor shifting from sweet to complex to exhilarating. It provided not just refreshment, but energy, a divine fuel that powered the gods' ability to perceive all things, to move between realms, to shape reality with their thoughts and words. The transformation that occurred when ambrosia and nectar were consumed was the true miracle of these substances. Mortals who were granted a taste, such as Tantalus in his infamous crime, found their perception permanently altered. Their minds expanded beyond mortal limits, but their spirits tormented by the knowledge that they could never again partake. For the gods, regular consumption was essential to maintaining their divine nature. The substances worked together to transform the blood in their veins into ichor, a golden fluid that was thinner than mortal blood, but infinitely more potent. Ichor was the physical manifestation of immortality, a life force that repaired any injury, resisted any disease, and flowed through the divine body with a luminescence that could be seen through the skin when a god was particularly moved or exerted. When a god was wounded, as Ares was during the Trojan War, or Aphrodite when she intervened to save her son Aeneas, ichor would flow from the wound like molten gold, and the application of ambrosia would cause the injury to close instantly, the divine flesh knitting itself back together with a speed that seemed magical but was simply the natural property of immortal biology. The logistics of serving ambrosia and nectar to the assembled gods were managed with a precision that would impress the most experienced mortal banquet master. The daily feast was held in the great hall where the 12 principal gods would recline on couches arranged in a circle, symbolizing their theoretical equality despite Zeus's authority. Lesser deities, nymphs, and divine servants would stand ready to assist, their movements choreographed to ensure that no cup remained empty, no plate stayed bare for more than a moment. Hebe, whose name means youth, performed her duties with an eternal enthusiasm, her presence ensuring that the gods never felt the weight of their infinite years. Ganymede, the most beautiful of mortals, served with a grace that made his every movement a work of art, his presence a reminder that beauty itself was a form of divine power. The Muses would provide entertainment, their songs making both gods and mortals forget their cares, their music so perfect that it structured the very harmony of reality. The preparation of ambrosia was itself a secret art, known only to a few divine beings. While the raw substance arrived via the doves, it had to be processed and combined with other divine ingredients to make it palatable and effective. Hestia oversaw this process, her mastery of fire allowing her to heat ambrosia to the precise temperature where its properties were activated without being destroyed. Hephaestus provided the vessels and implements, crafting mixing bowls that could stir themselves and serving dishes that kept the food at perfect temperature. Demeter contributed herbs and essences that enhanced the flavor and nutritional properties, while Apollo's music was played during the mixing, infusing the substance with harmonic properties that aligned the gods' energies. The result was not merely a meal, but a complete physical and spiritual renewal, a daily affirmation of immortality that ensured the gods remained forever separate from the mortal world they governed. The significance of ambrosia and nectar extended beyond mere sustenance to become a symbol of divine status and a tool of divine politics. To be denied ambrosia was the worst punishment a god could suffer, worse than imprisonment in Tartarus, for it meant a slow decline from immortality to mere longevity, the divine essence fading like an ember losing its heat. The gods who sided with the Titans in the Titanomachy were denied ambrosia during their imprisonment, their ichor gradually thinning until they became merely very long-lived rather than truly immortal, a state of being that drove many to madness. Conversely, to be granted extra ambrosia was a sign of special favor, a reward for service that boosted a deity's power beyond its normal limits. When Zeus wished to reward a god for exceptional service, he would pour an extra measure of nectar himself, a gesture that conferred not just additional power, but the king's personal blessing, a mark of divine favor that elevated the recipient in the subtle hierarchy of Olympus. The dark side of this divine diet was revealed in the myths of those who stole or attempted to steal ambrosia. Tantalus, a mortal king who was invited to dine with the gods, stole nectar and ambrosia and shared it with his mortal friends, revealing divine secrets and threatening the cosmic order. His punishment in Tartarus, standing in a pool of water that receded when he tried to drink, beneath fruit trees whose branches rose when he reached for them, was designed not just to torment, but to illustrate the fundamental principle. Divine sustenance was not meant for mortals, and attempting to bridge that gap through theft rather than earned apotheosis would result in eternal frustration. The story served as a warning to mortals that immortality was not a gift to be taken, but a state to be earned through virtue, heroism, or divine favor, and that the attempt to seize it through deception would result not in elevation, but in degradation. The fall of Olympus did not come with a thunderclap or a final battle between gods and mortals, but with a gradual quieting of prayers, a slow emptying of temples, a creeping skepticism that whispered questions where once there had been certainty. The decline of ancient Greek religion was a process that unfolded over centuries, a complex transformation driven by internal philosophical developments, external cultural pressures, and the relentless march of history that rendered the old gods increasingly irrelevant to the daily lives of their former worshippers. The mountain that had seemed eternal, the gods who had appeared immortal, found themselves facing an enemy more insidious than any titan: indifference, the slow erosion of belief that left them powerful but purposeless, present but ignored, like aging monarchs whose subjects had learned to govern themselves without divine intervention. The first cracks in the foundation of Olympian authority appeared not from without, but from within, in the philosophical schools that began to emerge in the 6th century before the Common Era. The pre-Socratic philosophers, thinkers like Thales, Anaximander, and Heraclitus, proposed naturalistic explanations for phenomena that had previously been attributed to divine action. Thales suggested that water was the fundamental principle of all things, implicitly denying that the world had been shaped by the personal actions of gods. Anaximander introduced the concept of the apeiron, an infinite and indefinite principle that governed reality through necessity rather than divine caprice. Heraclitus spoke of a logos, a rational principle that ordered the cosmos, a concept that gradually replaced the notion of Zeus's arbitrary will as the explanation for why things happened as they did. These philosophers did not explicitly deny the existence of the gods, but they redefined them, reducing them from active governors of the universe to symbolic representations of natural forces, or, in some interpretations, to mere mortal projections of psychological needs. The Sophists, and later Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, continued this process of demythologization. Socrates' famous questioning method undermined the traditional stories about the gods, exposing their contradictions and moral failings. When he asked whether the gods loved something because it was good, or whether it was good because the gods loved it, he was challenging the very foundation of divine authority, suggesting that morality existed independently of Olympian decree. Plato's theory of forms posited a realm of perfect, abstract ideals that was more real than the physical world, a conception that made the squabbling anthropomorphic gods of Olympus seem crude and inferior. His famous critique in the Republic, where he suggested that the traditional myths about the gods should be censored because they depicted divine beings behaving immorally, struck at the heart of the religious tradition. Aristotle's unmoved mover, a purely intellectual deity that set the cosmos in motion through the attraction of its perfection, was so abstract that it bore no resemblance to the Zeus who hurled thunderbolts and seduced mortals. The rise of mystery religions offered an alternative form of spiritual satisfaction that the traditional worship of Olympus could not provide. The Eleusinian mysteries, dedicated to Demeter and Persephone, promised initiates a blessed afterlife, a personal salvation that did not depend on the whims of the entire pantheon, but on the direct intervention of specific deities who cared for their worshippers' eternal fate. The cult of Dionysus offered ecstatic experience, a direct communion with the divine through wine and ritual madness that bypassed the formal structures of temple worship. The worship of Asclepius, the god of healing, at his sanctuaries provided practical benefits, cures for ailments that prayers to the distant Olympians had failed to secure. These cults grew in popularity precisely because they addressed individual spiritual needs that the broad, state-focused worship of Olympus had neglected. People began to seek personal relationships with specific gods rather than participating in the collective veneration of the entire pantheon. The conquests of Alexander the Great and the subsequent Hellenistic period introduced Greek culture to a vast array of foreign influences that both enriched and diluted the traditional religion. The syncretism that resulted, where Greek gods were identified with Egyptian, Persian, and Indian deities, transformed the clear, distinct personalities of the Olympians into blurred, composite figures. Zeus Ammon, a fusion of Zeus with the Egyptian ram-headed god Amun, was worshipped as a universal deity whose nature transcended cultural boundaries. This universalism, while philosophically sophisticated, eroded the specific local connections that had made the Greek gods feel immediate and relevant to their worshippers. When a god belonged to everyone, he began to belong to no one in particular, his stories losing the cultural specificity that had given them meaning. The Olympians became abstractions, their myths literary curiosities rather than living narratives that shaped moral behavior and social identity. The Roman conquest of Greece accelerated this process of decline, ironically, by elevating the Greek gods to new heights of prestige, while simultaneously hollowing out their spiritual significance. The Romans identified their own gods with the Greek pantheon, Jupiter with Zeus, Juno with Hera, Neptune with Poseidon. But they interpreted these deities through their own cultural lens, one that emphasized state power and military glory over the Greek values of arete and sophrosine. The Greek gods became Romanized, their worship incorporated into the imperial cult that served political purposes rather than spiritual needs. Temples were built across the empire, but they functioned as much as monuments to Roman power as houses of genuine worship. The Olympic Games, originally a religious festival dedicated to Zeus, continued under Roman sponsorship, but lost much of their spiritual significance, becoming instead a celebration of empire and athletic prowess. The final blow to Olympian authority came with the rise of Christianity and the conversion of the Roman Empire. Emperor Constantine's Edict of Milan in 313 of the Common Era granted religious tolerance to Christians, but his own conversion and the subsequent Christianization of the imperial bureaucracy created an environment increasingly hostile to the old religion. Theodosius I's edicts in the late 4th century went further, actively suppressing pagan worship, closing temples, and prohibiting sacrifices. In 393 of the Common Era, Theodosius officially ended the Olympic Games, the central religious festival of Zeus, striking at the heart of the cult that had maintained Olympus's preeminence for over a millennium. The physical temples were closed, their treasures confiscated, their priests dispersed. The sacred fires were extinguished, the statues of the gods were removed or destroyed, and the rituals that had structured Greek life for centuries were declared illegal. Yet the old gods did not die easily. In the remote regions of Greece, particularly in the mountains of the Mani Peninsula, traditional worship persisted into the 9th century of the Common Era, centuries after the official suppression of paganism. These were not the grand public ceremonies of classical times, but private household rituals, offerings made in secret, prayers whispered in the dark. The gods became household spirits, less powerful than they had been, but still present. Their names invoked for protection, fertility, and healing. This domestication of the divine represented the final stage of decline, the transformation of cosmic rulers into local genii, their thrones on Olympus exchanged for corners in peasant homes. Eventually, even these practices faded, the old names forgotten, the rituals abandoned, the gods themselves fading into the realm of story and legend, their marble palaces crumbling to dust, their golden feasts becoming memories. The physical remains of ancient worship on and around Mount Olympus provide tangible evidence of the mountain's spiritual significance that outlived the decline of the religion itself. Archaeological excavations by scholars have uncovered a rich tapestry of ritual activity that spans from the Mycenaean period through the early Middle Ages, demonstrating that the mountain was not merely a literary metaphor, but a lived sacred landscape. On the lower slopes of Olympus, sanctuaries and altars dating to the archaic and classical periods have been discovered, their stones worn smooth by the hands of countless worshippers who made the pilgrimage to approach the divine realm. These were not casual visitors, but devoted pilgrims who climbed the mountain seeking communion with the gods, leaving behind votive offerings, pottery fragments, and the ashes of sacrifices that speak of genuine spiritual seeking. The sanctuary at Dion, located at the foot of Mount Olympus, served as the primary cult center for the worship of Zeus and the other Olympian gods in the region. This site, which developed from a simple sanctuary into a prosperous city, demonstrates the economic and social importance of the cult. The archaeological remains include temples, theaters, stadiums, and living quarters that show how religion was integrated into every aspect of civic life. The city's prosperity was directly tied to its role as a religious center, pilgrims bringing wealth that funded public works and supported a population of priests, artisans, and merchants whose livelihoods depended on the continuing vitality of the cult. Roman additions to the site, including baths and administrative buildings, show that the worship of Olympus remained economically significant, even as its spiritual meaning evolved under imperial influence. On the summit of Olympus itself, particularly on the peak known as Mythicus, which ancient tradition identified as the throne of Zeus, archaeologists have found evidence of sacrificial activity dating back to at least 400 years before the Common Era. The discovery of pottery fragments, coins, and ash deposits at such a height, where the air is thin and the climb perilous, proves that ancient peoples were not afraid to approach the divine realm, contrary to some modern assumptions. These were not accidental deposits, but deliberate offerings, the physical traces of rituals designed to bring worshippers into direct contact with the divine, to place their prayers literally at the feet of the gods. The sun sets behind Mount Olympus, as it has for millennia, painting the snow-capped peaks in shades of rose and gold that seem too perfect to be natural, as if the mountain itself remembers how to arrange light for maximum beauty. The clouds that gather around the summit are not the impenetrable barriers they once were, penetrated now by aircraft and satellites, photographed by drones and mapped by precision instruments. Yet they retain their ancient mystery, forming and dissolving in patterns that suggest intention rather than mere meteorology. The mountain endures, its limestone bones older than the gods who were said to dwell upon it. Its slopes witness to the entire span of human civilization, from the Mycenaeans who first told stories of the divine council to the modern climbers who seek its summit for sport rather than worship. In this endurance, Olympus offers a final lesson about the nature of myth itself, that the stories may fade, the worshippers may die, the temples may crumble, but the places that inspired the stories remain. Their physical presence, a bridge across time that allows us to stand where our ancestors stood and feel, if only for a moment, the awe that moved them to imagine gods. The gods themselves, if they ever truly existed beyond the human imagination that created them, have long since withdrawn from the world. Their marble palaces empty, their golden feasts ended, their thunderbolts silent. Yet their influence persists in ways that are both obvious and subtle. Our language is filled with their names and stories. We speak of martial arts from Mars, of aphrodisiacs from Aphrodite, of Echo from the nymph who pined for Narcissus, of Nemesis from the goddess of retribution. Our literature continues to return to these tales, finding in them archetypes that explain the human condition, characters that represent our best and worst selves, narratives that structure our understanding of heroism, tragedy, love, and loss. Our psychology uses them: the Oedipus complex, the narcissistic personality, the Electra complex, all derived from myths that were once living religion but are now analytic tools. Our very understanding of narrative, of character, of dramatic structure was shaped by the Greeks who told these stories to explain their world. The decline of Olympus was not a failure, but a transformation, the inevitable evolution of human spirituality as it matured from simple anthropomorphism to more abstract conceptions of the divine. The gods served their purpose, providing a framework for understanding a chaotic world, offering comfort in times of suffering, explaining the inexplicable, and giving structure to societies that needed divine sanction for their laws and customs. When those societies grew sophisticated enough to question the stories, to seek naturalistic explanations, to develop philosophy and science, the gods receded not because they were defeated, but because they were no longer necessary in their original form. They became literature, they became art, they became psychology, they became the foundation upon which Western civilization built its understanding of itself. In this sense, Olympus never truly fell. It simply changed, transformed from a physical mountain housing divine kings into a conceptual mountain of the mind, a summit of human achievement in storytelling, imagination, and the search for meaning. The archaeologists who excavate the slopes of Olympus, the scholars who translate ancient texts, the tourists who photograph its peaks, the neo-pagans who light incense in its shadow, are all engaged in the same essential activity, the attempt to connect with something larger than themselves, to understand the stories that shape their culture, to find in the past some key to the present. The mountain accommodates all these quests, its physical reality grounding the abstract speculations, its ancient stones bearing silent witness to the fleeting nature of all human belief. The gods may have abandoned Olympus, but humanity has not, each generation finding its own reason to approach the mountain, to tell its stories anew, to seek in heights of stone some reflection of the heights of spirit. And so the mountain remains, dreaming its slow geological dreams, its peaks wearing clouds like the gods once wore their divine raiment, its slopes bearing forests that have grown and died and regrown across the centuries. The difference between myth and geology is one of timescale. The gods lived for millennia, but the mountain lives for eons. The stories of Olympus will fade eventually, as all stories do, lost to the erosion of memory and the shifting of languages. But the mountain will remain, its limestone recording in layers the history of the world, waiting perhaps for some future civilization to climb its slopes, see its beauty, and invent new gods to explain its majesty. For the human need to personify the sublime, to tell stories about the forces that shape our lives, seems as eternal as stone itself, as enduring as the mountain that once housed the gods and now houses only their memory, their legacy, and the endless echo of their stories in the minds of those who look up at its peaks and feel, despite all rational knowledge, that something divine might still dwell there, watching, waiting, dreaming the long dream of eternity. If you found yourself captivated by this journey through the rise and fall of Mount Olympus, if the stories of gods and titans, of divine feasts and cosmic wars resonated with something deep within your own imagination, then this channel was made for you. Mystic Nightfall exists to explore these ancient tales in all their beauty and complexity, to bring the myths to life through immersive storytelling that honors both their historical significance and their enduring power to move us. Subscribe to join a community of listeners who understand that these old stories are not dead history, but living poetry, that the gods may have fallen silent, but their echoes still shape our world. Like and share if you feel the same awe that moved the ancient Greeks to build temples and spin tales. And leave a comment telling us which myth you would like to explore next. The mountain still stands, the stories remain, and there are countless tales yet to tell. Join us and let us continue this journey together into the heart of mythology, where every story is a path to understanding ourselves, our world, and the divine spark that exists in all great tales.